If you can see us, we are dangerous indeed. But that is as nothing to the peril you face if you cannot see us, and all you can hear is our laughter. The Legiones Astartes are varied in their applications of strategy, martial prowess, and doctrines. Though all proficient in the arts of combat, they are disparate and unknowable to one another. For while many Astartes flaunt their skill at arms, not all are respected or understood in their methods of waging war. For today, we shall elucidate the most misunderstood and mysterious of all the legions. The 5th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, the White Scars. The 5th Legion would have one of the most obscured and overlooked histories of any of the Legiones Astartes. Formed during the Wars of Unification by the Emperor of Mankind, alike to all the founding legions, the 5th would be tasked with a special role in mind. Drawn from the technomadic tribesmen of the Fulian Basin, the 5th would initially only number in the hundreds. Braving the harshest environments of terror, the 5th would rove the wasted landscapes of a planet divided, in their task to root out the many warlords and upstart empires that would defy the Emperor. Striking without warning and at great speed, the 5th would annihilate the easy prey before them. To better reunify the disparate factions of humanity, the Emperor would need a force capable of pathfinding the many worlds and strongholds of the fragments of humanity. To this end, the 5th Legion, then known as the Star Hunters, would chart the unknown territories of the galaxy and relay information to the newly forged Imperium. Organized into small, mobile battalions, the 5th Legion would charge into battle and wreak havoc before falling back to allow larger legions, such as the 1st, to be the hammer blow against their disorganized and crippled adversaries. A lightning strike across the stars, the Star Hunters would probe their enemies' defenses for weaknesses before landing their killing blow. An efficient and yet elusive legion, their need to constantly be on the move and distance themselves from their brother legions would shroud the 5th into an unpredictable and mysterious force. Resolving to never ask for aid, the 5th Legion would assume their duties with unwavering discipline, not waging their wars for pride, but rather duty. Their deeds would be forgotten by the wider Imperium and its scholars, for it was the nature of the Star Hunters to be reclusive. For over a Terran century, the 5th Legion would continue their arduous and lonely crusade, separating and fragmenting further as the need for pathfinders continued to grow. Each day seen by the Legion as a victory to their cause, the 5th would never relent in their continued push to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. Yet soon, the slowly diminishing Legion would be renewed with the discovery of their long-lost Primarch, Jaghatai Khan. Upon the world of Mundus Planus, the Emperor of Mankind, alongside his most favored son, Horus Lupercal, would discover the feudal world that would later be known as Chogoris. The vast plains of the world would harbor a man once known as Katugu Suogu, now titled as the Kargan, or Khan of Khans. His former name lost to history, the man who would now be known as Jaghatai had bested the world's Palatine tyrant overlord and united the tribes of Chogoris. Pledging his loyalty to the Emperor only 6 months following his conquest of his homeworld, Jaghatai would now conquer the galaxy in the name of his father, the Emperor, to enable humanity's sovereignty of the stars. Reveling the challenge of an entire galaxy of planets to bring into compliance, Jaghatai would swiftly be gifted his legions Astartes and begin the task of rebuilding its fractured ranks. Dispatching a grand summons to every company of the 5th Legion across the stars, Jaghatai would muster his forces to join at the world of Chogoris. For a decade, the disparate 5th Legion would slowly begin to answer the call of their Primarch until the dawn of the 31st millennium. The Legion had been comprised of strangers, brothers without a common legacy or heritage. Upon the empty quarter's vast plains, the Kargan would address thousands of Astartes from hundreds of worlds. 50,000 Astartes, all sharing a genetic legacy, but none unified by purpose. The Khan would declare that every one of the 5th Legion must prove their loyalty to both himself and the Legion by ritually scarring their faces. Eschewing their former names, these Astartes would adopt new names to reflect their deeds, their culture, or their devotion to the Khan. Reborn as the White Scars from then on, the 5th Legion now unified with common cause and an identity that would span every creed and culture of its Astartes, the White Scars, now blooded, would ascend to add their blades to the Great Crusade. The Ordu Jaghatai would begin their conquest of the stars within the Kolan Circle of Worlds. Pitting his legion against unwinnable odds for a single company, the Khan of Khans would test the might of his sons by facing the many factions of human separatists and Xenos outposts. Allowing cooperation between his sons born of hundreds of cultures, the White Scars would work together to bring their foes to heel, led in battle by their indomitable Primarch. With his legion now 80,000 Astartes strong, Jaghatai would mold his warriors into his own image. Their ferocity in battle proven and tactics tested to their limit, the White Scars would end the crusade of the Kolan Circle and bring its planet Primus, Kolan, into the fold of the 5th Legion's territories. Replenishing the losses of his legion and embarking with an army reforged in blood and fire. Standing alongside their distant cousin legions once more, the White Scars would prove to be a force adept at disciplined, swift, and deadly engagements. Mischaracterized as similar to the Eaters of Worlds or the Rout, the White Scars would, regardless of their pedigree, remain a maligned and distrusted legion. Seeking little glory for their deeds, the Scars would conduct their tasks with glee, with Primarch Sanguinius of the Blood Angels' 9th Legion remarking, "They smile often, and they laugh when they kill." Untamed by the Imperial truth, the White Scars would grant no mercy to their foes, yet prove themselves an effective legion in the eyes of the Emperor. Though detractors of the 5th Legion's strategies, such as the Primarch of the Ultramarines, Rabute Guilliman, or of their beliefs, such as Lorgar Aurelian, would make their displeasure known, the White Scars would disregard the opinions of outsiders, lacking the nuance to understand their creed. The bonds of brotherhood, few amongst the Legion, the White Scars would be accepted by only the Thousand Sons, Lunar Wolves, and Blood Angels as equals. Yet with the end of the Great Crusade drawing to a close, the White Scars would lack for the battles they preferred to wage. The wild spaces of the galaxy had dwindled, and their utility as warriors of the Emperor seemed to be nearly obsolete. Their last great battle of the Great Crusade, Ulanor, marking the peak of the Legion's glories prior to their involvement in the Great Civil War, which would rend the galaxy. For the favor of Horus Lupercal as War Master would be proven to be misplaced. With the descent of the War Master into the clutches of the ruinous powers, the Primarch of the now Sons of Horus would seek to bring his brother Primarchs into the fold of his betrayal. Though many such as Mortarion of the Death Guard and Angron of the World Eaters would be quick to turn against the Imperium, both loyalists and traitors would be uncertain as to which side the White Scars would lend their might. The Kargan had often derided the Emperor's decisions and actions, and the Legion's wild nature would seemingly be an indication of their proclivity to savagery. Jaghatai would observe the bare threads of information he had gleaned during the opening stages of the heresy. Miscommunication and treachery would be rife, and as such, the Kargan would stay his hand. With the Legion's persecution of the Orc Xenos within the Chondak system, the White Scars would receive their first insight into the actions of the War Master. Learning that the Space Wolves Legion had burned Prospero to the ground, the loyalty of the 6th Legion would be brought into question. Seeking answers to the fall of his most cherished brother and his legion, Jaghatai would journey to Prospero to find answers. Hindered by the ruin storm spawned by the Word Bearers, the White Scars would be requested by the Imperial Fist Primarch, Rogel Dawn, to return to Holy Terror to defend the Throne World. Jaghatai's independent and resolute nature would cause him to ignore such pleas, as he would find the answers he needed alone. Ignoring the request for aid of the seemingly renegade Primarch, Leman Russ, during his engagement with the Alpha Legion, the White Scars would not join the fray until the wounds of treachery were clear to observe. Breaching the Alpha Legion blockade and journeying to Prospero, the Kargan himself and his Kashyyyk honor guard would investigate the ashes of the once proud bastion of the Thousand Suns. Meanwhile, the members of the White Scars warrior lodges would declare their allegiance to Horus with the absence of their Primarch. Controlling the flagship of the 5th Legion, Hasik Noyan Khan would attempt to usurp the Kargan's forces. Yet with the involvement of the stalwart Astartes, Shiban Khan, the White Scars loyal to the Emperor and their Primarch would oppose the White Scars traitors. Upon Prospero, Jaghatai would be separated from his Kashyyyk and find his answers in the form of an apparition of his brother, Magnus the Red. Believing the wolves of Fenris to be dispatched by the Emperor, rather than their manipulation of the War Master, Magnus would deem the Imperium to have betrayed his legion. Explaining that only 2 paths could be chosen by the Kargan, Magnus would implore his brother to side with Horus as he had done many times before. Despite the Khan's loyalties always being strongest between both Magnus and Horus, Jaghatai would refuse such a poisoned chalice. Acknowledging Magnus's betrayal of the Emperor, Jaghatai would destroy the apparition and, with answers found, return to his fleet. Meanwhile, the White Scars battled one another above the world of Prospero. Shiban would assault the White Scars' flagship, Swordstorm, and attempt to bring the treacherous Hasik Noyan Khan to justice. Brother fought brother as the loyalist White Scars fought their way to the flagship's bridge. Warships of the 14th Legion, the Death Guard, began to enter the Prospero system and surround the White Scars fleet. Gemulan Noyan Khan would join the loyalist contingent in facing Hasik. The battle would even the forces of the loyalists to match the traitors. Yet for blood to be prevented from spilling further, the Legion would need their Primarch to end the division in their ranks. On Prospero, Jaghatai would be confronted by the Primarch of the Death Guard, Mortarion, whom would offer the Khan a chance to join the traitor legions. Refusing his offer, Jaghatai and his men would face the Death Guard. With the aid of the last son of Prospero, Revuel Arvida, the White Scars would best the Death Guard and return to the Swordstorm. Returning to his legion in disarray, Jaghatai would confront Hasik Noyan Khan. Paralyzing Hasik by his own hand, Jaghatai would end the treachery that had seeped into his legion. As the Death Guard began to engage the White Scars fleet, Jaghatai and the White Scars would defend themselves from the 14th Legion. With the conclusion of the battle, Jaghatai would see to the unrest within his legion. Giving his traitorous sons the chance of redemption, some would be executed for remaining loyal to the War Master. Founding the Sagya Mazan, a formation of White Scars now honor-bound to redeem their past crimes, the White Scars would banish these penitent Astartes from their ranks until their redemption had been achieved. Following the restoration of their common cause, the Kargan would lead his legion for 4 Terran Standard years in harrying and bleeding the traitor forces. Over time, the traitors would begin to adapt to the 5th Legion's tactics and blunt their efforts. Combating the Iron Warriors, Emperor's children, sons of Horus and Death Guard, for many years, the White Scars would begin to fatigue. Managing to journey to Holy Terra with the discovery of the Dark Glass artifact, and sacrifice of both their first captain, Kin Jar, and Chief Stormseer, Targatai Yasugai, the Scars would endure. Aiding in the loyalist defense of the Throne World during the Siege of Terra, the White Scars would prove invaluable. Complementing the Imperial Fist's doctrines of defense and fortification, the White Scars would cut down the traitors as they broke themselves against the walls of the Imperial Palace. The Legion's close ties to the Blood Angels also aiding in their synergy with the Defenders of the Throne, the White Scars would aid in reinforcing the Lionsgate spaceport and defeating the advance of the Death Guard Legion under the command of their now chaos-corrupted Primarch, Mortarion. With the War Master's defeat during the pivotal final battle between Horus Lupercal and the Emperor, the White Scars would stand as one of the few loyalist legions to stand in defense of the Imperium during its darkest hour. Securing the Ultima Segmentum with the appointment of Roboute Guilliman as Lord Commander of the now vulnerable Imperium, the 5th Legion would spend the next 70 years cleansing the galaxy of the traitor legions. Yet as they returned to their homeworld of Chogoris, they would find the Yasan sector to be overrun and pillaged by the Dark Eldar, the Drukhari. Enraged, Jaghatai Khan would wage a crusade to purge the Xenos from the Yasan sector. Chogoris had been spared much of the destruction, yet many citizens under the protection of the Kargan had been enslaved by the foul Xenos. Taking the fight to his now most hated enemy, Jaghatai would lead the 5th Legion on a path of vengeance. Reclaiming worlds of the Yasan sector, slowly, the White Scars would restore order. Informed of the introduction of the Codex Astartes throughout the Imperium, Jaghatai would willingly separate his legion into Codex-compliant chapters. His legion had always seen independence as a virtue, and as a result, show little resistance to the new structure of their Astartes forces. Seeing his now chapters as extensions of his son's freedom to persecute the enemies of his Imperium, the Khan would continue to hunt the Dark Eldar with his now chapter of White Scars veterans. Commanding his successor chapters to continue to wage the Yasan campaign until not a single Xenos tainted its worlds, the Kargan would nonetheless be saddened at the removal of the trappings of his once proud legion upon his sons. Succeeding in their continued destruction of the Drukhari, Jaghatai would confront the Archon of the Dark Eldar on the world of Khorrasil 5. With the aid of the Destroyers, Rampagers, and Stormlords chapters, the Khan and his White Scars would corner the Archon. The Archon would retreat into the Webway, with Jaghatai Khan and his First Brotherhood charging into the rapidly closing portal. His deeds thereafter unknown, the White Scars believe that one day the Kargan will return to Chogoris and lead his chapter once more. Until then, it is believed that he still fights to this day, his free spirit untethered from all responsibilities but hunting his enemies. Initially recruiting the Astartes of the Legion from the training centers of Holy Terror, should they be deemed worthy, their training would continue on the moon of Luna. Implanted with the gene seed of the 5th Legion, the Astartes would be inducted into the then Star Hunters. With the discovery of their Primarch, Jaghatai, the Legion would, upon their renaming as the White Scars, diversify their training of initiates to the ocean world of KO-9, gas giant of Revelat Tyrades, and battleship Vormal. For those exceptionally promising candidates, their training would be mentored by Astartes instructors of Chogoris. Exceptionally supportive of their initiates, the Chogorans, unlike many legions such as the Lunar Wolves, would praise their candidates to what some would believe to be an excessive degree. Taught Korchin, the dialect of Chogoris, the difficult dialect would further test the initiate's mental acuity. With the ending of the Horus Heresy and beyond, the White Scars would recruit solely from Chogoris. The homeworld of the White Scars permits the warring of each of the planet's tribes, enabling the strongest of those born through battle to be chosen as neophytes of the chapter. With their bloodlines strengthened through toil, each nomadic tribe shall be visited by the giant warriors of the mountain fortress of Quan Zhao to induct their mightiest warriors into the chapter. Observing the battles between the tribes, the Scars, though distant from the planet's tribal communities, remain entrenched as legends amongst their peoples. Those whom are judged as worthy shall be taken by the grim warriors clad in white, red and gold to the fortress monastery, never to be seen again by their families, for they shall now ascend to become an angel of his Imperium. Imbued with gene seed and the ferocity of his homeworld, these White Scars shall continue their chapter's legacy of honor. Venerating the Emperor and their Primarch above all, whilst not acknowledging the Emperor as a god, the White Scars do believe that he is the ultimate uniter of mankind. To that end, the 5th do not require a stringent fervor to the ecclesiarchy, whilst nonetheless utilizing chaplains within their ranks. The symbol of their chapter, the lightning bolt, representing both the scars on their faces and the speed to which they strike down their foes. Heeding the teachings of their Stormseers, the White Scars revere the elements of air, land, and animalistic power of the elements. Their death said to free their souls to embark within the afterlife to travel the planes of the Neverworld. Taught to study the so-called noble pursuits by their Primarch, the White Scars devote much of their time outside of battle, perfecting the arts of hunting, calligraphy, and retelling of their chapter's glories. Held as replacement for the Imperial truth, the noble pursuits would hone the White Scars' mental well-being, whilst keeping their connection to Jagoras strong. Derided by Primarchs such as Rabute Guilliman and Lorgar Aurelian with its inception, these pursuits nonetheless prove valuable in enabling the White Scars to flourish. In battle, the White Scars are encouraged to laugh while slaying their foes, not out of a sense of enjoyment of slaughter, but rather to battle with unrestrained martial prowess and enjoyment of their skill at arms. A highly courteous legion, and thus chapter to outsiders of their number, the White Scars value honesty in their dealings with army regiments outside of the chapter. Adherents to the Librarius, the White Scars revere the power and authority of their so-called Stormseers. Jagatai Khan would aid in the drafting of the protocols of the Librarius, and as such, the White Scars would be a staunch force for the benefits of Psykers during the Council of Nicaea. Yet the Stormseers of the Legion would value restraint of their powers, rather than delving too deep into the machinations of the Warp. Understanding the Warp's corrupting influence, the White Scars revere its potency in battle, yet remain wary of its influence. Their discipline of wielding the Warp, known as the Test of Heaven, the White Scars more than any legion understand the potential danger the Warp poses. Believing the Warp not to be inherently evil, Stormseers such as Tagutai Yusugai would argue that its use must be respected, and those adept in its use must be rigorously trained to harness and control it. Yet any dealings with entities within the Warp should be indiscriminately avoided to prevent corruption with those who dabble with such beings. For each new member of the chapter, they shall relinquish their loyalty to their tribe and replace such fervor for that of the Emperor and the legacy of their chapter. Now a member of a 100 Astartes-strong brotherhood, they shall be commanded by their Khan, who in turn shall serve the orders of the chapter's Great Khan. For even during their days as a legion, the White Scars deferred the use of the Imperium Standard Ranking Organization and terminologies and replaced them with their own trappings and customs. Brotherhoods during the days of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy would be far larger and be designated varying titles. Brotherhoods such as the Brotherhood of the Storm, Brotherhood of the Moon, and Brotherhood of Summer Lightning comprised of vast variances in heritage. Initially drawn from their original pioneer companies, many brotherhoods would be referred as brotherhoods by their Jagoran brethren, even should its members refer to themselves as a company. At its peak, the White Scars would encompass over 95,000 Astartes prior to the Horus Heresy. Due to such numbers, the brotherhoods of the chapter would be further compiled into hordes of different sizes. Their number would vary from 5,000 to 20,000 strong. Commanded by their Noyan Khans, the hordes of the White Scars would not be renewed with the application of the Codex Astartes and its diminishment to the role of chapter. The White Scars during the era Indomitus would still employ brotherhoods, but only 10 in number, at a much diminished size to their former glory. Fielding a preponderance of assault bikes and fast-moving vehicles, the White Scars differ from most chapters of the Adeptus Astartes in their overwhelming deployment of vehicles compared to their cousin chapters. Utilizing their Stormseers to divine subtle warp manipulations, such as weather alterations of fog and wind, to impede their opponents and obscure their forces, the White Scars, when deployed in battle, utilize a varied arrangement of strategies to bolster their lightning-fast attacks. Though ill-suited to the tactics of the White Scars, the chapter on rare occasions does deploy destroyer squads and heavy weaponry, yet prefers to keep such units in reserve for only the most unavoidable of deployments. Referred to during the days of the Legion as the Dark Sons of Death, or Karoglanlar, these seemingly deranged omens of ill fortune would be dispatched by the Stormseer Council for only the most dire of battles. A highly decentralized force, the White Scars, alike to the Alpha Legion, exercise high amounts of self-reliance without the authority of command figures. Khans employ the use of Kavkhans as their first officers, though the title is not officially ratified within their ranks. With their legacies inherited as a legion, informing their transition into a Codex-compliant chapter, the White Scars would form into their new organizational structure with little difficulty. A predominantly Codex-compliant chapter, the White Scars do however eschew the Tome's guidelines for battle, preferring their tried-and-true fast-moving mechanized and airborne tactics. Formed of 10 companies known as Brotherhoods, each company is led by a Khan. The first Brotherhood, known as the Spear Point Brotherhood, is formed of the chapter's veterans. A devastating force armed with the finest weapons and armor, the First Brotherhood are often dispatched to various strike forces to further bolster their effectiveness. The second to fifth Brotherhoods, known as the Firefist, Eagle, Tulwar, and Stormwrath Brotherhoods, act as the chapter's battle companies. At the forefront of each White Scars offensive, the battle companies utilize the mobility of their assault bikes to great effect. Rarely deployed en masse, a single Brotherhood is often more than sufficient in laying waste to any enemy foolish enough to test the speed of such a vast company. The 6th to 9th companies, the Hawkeye, Painstalker, Bloodrider, and Stormbolt Brotherhoods act as the reserve companies. Reinforcing the battle companies as needed, the reserve companies are required to be in close proximity to deployment due to the complication to travel incurred by the warp storms across the galaxy. Quickly able to reinforce failing lines of battle, the reserve companies respond with haste to support any engagement wherein the tide of battle begins to turn for the worse. Each reserve company harbors vehicle support necessary for any engagement. The 6th Hawkeye Brotherhood trains a small crew of Predator and Repulsor tanks for the rare occasions they are needed. The 7th Painstalker Brotherhood maintain a small reserve of land speeders with highly trained pilots. The 8th Bloodrider Brotherhood excel in close combat engagements, and should they excel, are often reassigned to the battle companies as needed. The 9th Stormbolt Brotherhood encompasses Eliminator and Hellblaster squads to aid in their heavy firepower requirements. And finally, the 10th Windspeaker Brotherhood maintains the neophytes of the chapter. Proven worthy in battle, the neophytes of the chapter are molded by the crucible of battle to ensure their proficiency. Specializing in stealth attacks, the neophytes are tutored by the Master of Recruits and mentored closely by the Brotherhood Sergeants. The power armor of the White Scars is one of the most ornate of all the Legiones and Adeptus Astartes. Trimmed with red and embellished with gold ornamentation, the gleaming white armor of the 5th draws inspiration from the tribes of Chagoris in their use of iconography and ornamentation. Their squad and company are marked on their knee or greaves, rather than the Codex Astartes outline of the shoulder guard. Due to each Brotherhood containing 10 squads, the White Scars normally identify their squad placement on their left knee plate. Each squad sergeant displays a red lightning bolt design upon his right leg armor of varying designs. Assault bike squads adorn their helmets with tribal markings, though non-bike Astartes paint their helmets to denote rank. Sergeants paint their helmets red, set with a skull in its center, whilst veterans eschew the skull adornment and add a crux symbol on their right shoulder guard. Veteran sergeants retain the red paint and skull on their helmets, yet add a white stripe in its center. Lieutenants of the White Scars invert this design by wearing white helmets with a skull stud and a red band across the brow. The Khans, meanwhile, wear white helmets with a skull stud and add a winged skull on their right pauldron. Squad specializations such as battle line, close support, fire support, or veterans are indicated in red on the right shoulder guard, with their chapter iconography of the lightning bolt displayed with pride on their left shoulder guard. Yet members of the 10th Brotherhood of Scouts, by chapter law, cannot utilize the horizontal bar beneath the thunderbolt of the chapter icon until they ascend to the rank of full initiates of the chapter. The command of the White Scars employs a vast assortment of unique identifiers and specialists. The title of Kargan is reserved for the Primarch of the Legion, Jagatai Khan. Noyan Khan is a rank used only during the years of the Legion, for each Noyan Khan would command Ordus, comprised of as many as 20 Brotherhood companies. The Great Khan serves as chapter master during the era Indomitus. The Great Khan is chosen by the Stormseers of the chapter by trials of mental, physical, and spiritual trials. Deciding the fate of the chapter during the Kurultai, or Gathering of Khans, the Great Khan alongside the chapter's chaplains oversee the actions of their many wars and engagements. Khans act as captains of the chapter, and each command a single brotherhood consisting of 100 Astartes. As the company masters of the chapter, the Khans are also deemed worthy by the Stormseers. The Master of the Hunt is an honorific first given to the Lord of Summer Lightning, Jubal Khan, during the Horus Heresy. The Khan known as the Master of the Hunt tracks down and kills the enemy of his chapter, whom have been engaged in combat and escaped the chapter's justice. Each nemesis is written in the Scroll of Vengeance, and when they are slain, their severed head is brought to the fortress monastery of Quan Zhao within Chagoris. Their heads embalmed with silver by the High Chaplain of the chapter, the heads of the slain enemies of the White Scars line the path to their fortress monastery. Armed with the chapter relic, Moondraken and Moonfang, the Master of the Hunt slays some of the single most terrible and deadly foes of his Imperium. The Kashig act as the honor guard and advisors of the Great Khan. An elite cadre of Terminator armor-clad Astartes, the Kashig are among the most skilled veterans of the chapter and lay waste to any whom seek to harm their Great Khan or stand in their path. For those of great skill, but in breach of the chapter's storied code of honor, they shall be clad in black ceramite and be known as the Ebon Kashig. Shields for their most vulnerable battle brothers, the Ebon Kashig are deployed into the most deadly of engagements and shall be redeemed only should they survive their engagement. The Stormseers of the chapter act as the librarians of the White Scars. Known as Zadyan Aga, Psykers of the chapter are enshrined in mystical traditions first introduced into the Legion by Jagatai Khan. Overseeing the promotion of both neophytes and Khans of the chapter, the Stormseers are among the most revered and respected members of the White Scars. For every 10 summers that pass over Chagoris, the Stormseers venture to the embattled tribes of the planet and draw recruits to be tested by the White Scars. Deciding in council the successor to each Great Khan, the Stormseers are integral to the continued structure and organization of the chapter. Believing that the Emperor will once again rise from his throne, the Stormseers prepare the White Scars for the return of their Primarch and the beginning of the next great crusade to unite humanity. The Mchi are the given names of the chapter's apothecaries, whom serve the medical needs and gene seed stores of the chapter. Their order within the chapter, Akoglanla, the apothecaries of the chapter preserve the legacy of Jagatai and his gene line with reverence, and are deployed as individual aides to various brotherhoods as needed. The Tech Marines of the chapter, the Iron Khans, oversee the vast stores of speed bikes, vehicles, and dreadnoughts deployed by the Legion. The High Chaplain of the White Scars is known as the Voice of the Storm, and monitors the spiritual well-being of the chapter, and leads the Gathering of Khans as the voice of the chapter. Though a chapter devoted to the arts of lightning strike warfare, the use of dreadnoughts is sparse among the White Scars. Imprisoned within their coffins, these Uhan Solban, translated as Guardians of the Morning and Evening Stars, the White Scars see the souls of such Astartes to be trapped within the dreadnought chassis. A fate worse than death for all White Scars, such units rarely see combat and are instead primarily used to guard the chapter's gene seed stores, both on Chagoris and Holy Terror, in order to preserve the legacy of those more fortunate than their guardians. Accepting their duty with solemn grace, the Uhan Solban rarely demand to fight the enemies of their chapter, and only when the tide of battle is dire and likely to end their vigil. And for those who err in their duty to uphold the chapter's honor, they shall be branded as Sagya Mazan. Exiled from the chapter, these penitent warriors must seek honor in death to absolve themselves of the failures and sins made in the name of their chapter.
My sons, it is more than 70 years since we cast the traitors from the walls of the Imperial Palace and began the restoration of our homeworld. We stand on the brink of victory. one that every sacrifice has counted towards. Today, we cleanse the galaxy of those who crossed our boundaries, violated our homes, and took our people. They will be crushed beneath our treads, disemboweled by our blades, and left shattered by our guns. I will give their heads on spikes, lining the roads of Chagoris. I will see their foul structures torn to the ground and turned to dust. Of their leader, I shall inflict 100-fold the pain it has caused my people. My sons, you shall each do the same.
This has been a tale of the Great Imperium of Man, read by the Remembrancer. The noble warriors of the White Scars, though misunderstood, are a reliable and honored legion, worthy of the Imperium's respect. Not all legions would earn the praise they deserved, yet the White Scars would not be embittered at the altar of pride. However, for our next transmission of the Legiones Astartes, we shall elucidate a legion drawn to desperation at their thankless toil. For we shall elucidate the bulwark of the traitor legions, the Iron Warriors.